Change is the heartbeat of the universe. There's this thing Marcus Aurelius, the Roman philosopher king, wrote about in his Meditations. Awesome piece of literature, by the way, called The Great Year. It's a giant 24,000 year long, according to the oldest sources, cycle of birth, death, and renewal that the earth constantly moves through with the divine goal of ascending human consciousness. It's a little woo woo, but stick with me. Um, Many of the most advanced civilizations, the Mayans with their calendar, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Hindu, Vedic religion, all believed a great deal in this cycle, despite being relative worlds apart, and what's more, shared similar end dates. Spoiler, there is no actual end to this cycle. There is no Armageddon. But according to the Hindu tradition, which provides the most coherent and complete explanation of what the Great Year is, there are transitional periods between different phases of the Great Year. A single phase was 2,700 years, according to the oldest Hindu calendars, that last for 300 years each. So basically, a single age, like the Kali Yuga, the Dvarpa Yuga, the Kali Yuga is like the worst age there is. That's like the one we're just now leaving. That's 2,700 years. And then at the end of that, there's this 300-year transitionary period where shit kind of hits the fan. It's like 300 years of Armageddon, basically. But it's when essentially ascension occurs for the human mind. It's, I don't know. I'll get into that later. But my theory is that these ancient peoples were actually tracking the cycles of a particularly nasty grand solar minimum. Sure enough, upon checking things out, it turned out that the last time we had one of these transitional periods, 976 BC, lines up perfectly with the Homeric minimum, a grand solar minimum that officially began in 970 BC. That grand solar minimum coincides pretty well with a time known as the Greek Dark Ages, in which the entire known world of that time went from having written languages and global trade to basically being a few steps above where they'd been in the Stone Age. It had to do with the Bronze Age shortage, or the collapse of the Bronze Age trade network because of a lack of tin. Tin was a necessary ingredient to turn copper into bronze. They could also use arsenic, but it was highly toxic. Anyway, back on track. So yeah, the Greeks would only learn writing again hundreds of years later using the Phoenician alphabet. And what they would remember from the time of that transitionary period is called the Age of Heroes. And that's when Hercules and Odysseus and all the other heroes are purported to have had their adventures during that 300-year transitionary period that occurred between the 2,700-year descending Kali Yuga and the 2,700-year ascending Kali Yuga. That 300-year transitionary period in between the two, that's when the Greek Age of Heroes and also the Homeric minimum, named for the Greek poet Homer, happened. So moving back to present day, the Mayan calendar said that we would enter this transitionary period in 2012, while the Vedic sources, or Indian sources, Hinduism, Indians, said that it would start in 2025, which, given that we're dealing with a 24,000 year calendar, a 10 year, 10 years of difference isn't particularly noteworthy, Um, yeah. So, but yeah, the those illiterate Greeks never gave an exact date, though we do know the Greek philosopher Solon said the Egyptian priests had told him that Atlantis had sunk 12,000 years earlier, from present day. So 12,000 years ago from current era, right? So it's a 24,000 year cycle with um, particularly large transitionary periods, large ages of heroes occurring every 12,000 years. Yeah. So, yeah, that was when Atlantis sank. So we can assume that the Greek calendar and the Egyptian calendars line up perfectly well with the Hindu and Mayan calendars. But yeah, interesting stuff. Also, apparently, the black holes at the center of our galaxy are around 25,000 light years away. So, whenever there's an eruption from one of those black holes, which sometimes uh, the arms leading out of them do erupt, uh, whatever light they give would take about 25,000 years to reach here. So, I don't know, it's interesting that the exact time that it takes our axis, the axis of the Earth, to complete a full rotation around yeah, all the different ages lines up perfectly with the exact number of light years, the black holes are away from us. So, yeah. Yeah. So, presumably on other planets that are further away from the galactic center than we are, their cycle would be 25,000 years, 26,000 years, 27,000 years, another 1,000 years for each, 1,000 light years away from the galactic center that they are. So, it's interesting stuff. I'll be linking below a video that actually talks a lot about the Homeric minimum. Actually, technically, the years preceding the Homeric minimum, because the Greek Dark Ages actually started uh, slightly before the Homeric minimum started, because, for a number of circumstances, our own global society in some ways echoes, not due to anyone's fault, just sort of how the cookie crumbled. It has a lot to do with the way our industries and population centers have sort of. Anyway, it's a lot of complexity layered upon complexity that wasn't really planned so much as it just sort of happened. I mean, people make babies. Try convincing them not to; they're gonna do it. And so, that was, I would say, the primary uh, factor that sort of pushed the way our society formed itself, And I mean, obviously, there's some degree of planning that goes into it, but it's always secondary to the fact that, well, people like banging, and babies come from that, and so, we've got a population of like 8 billion people, so, it's, but yeah, interesting video. You should definitely watch it. It's, yeah. It's about the years of the Homeric minimum and the years preceding the Homeric minimum, which is called the Bronze Age collapse, when all the trade networks just crumbled so incredibly badly that the Greeks forgot how to write, you know, and that's when Odysseus and Achilles and Agamemnon and Hercules and all those guys were doing their thing. Yeah. Something else I'll be linking is this article entitled "The End of the Kali Yuga is in 2025," and it's really cool, very in depth, and it just outlines the oldest versions of the Vedic calendars and sort of lines them up with actual historical timelines. Like, all right, in the old Vedic calendar, the transitionary period was uh, like going back to Atlantis or whatever, 9,000 BC or 9,900 BC, right? 12,000 years ago. And that was the rapid, intense cooling of the Younger Dryas period due to ostensibly a comet impact. Who knows? The ancient Egyptians told Solon that the earth was covered in fire, and the Vedic traditions say that it's Yuga fire from the sun. Nobody really knows for sure. And then 7,000 BC was another transitionary period. It happens every 2,700 years, right? That's a Yuga. One Yuga in the cycle is 2,700. And then, so the next one was 7,000 BC, and that was the Black Sea catastrophe of 6,700 BC. And there was this enormous earthquake and a glacial outburst, flooding, and there was flooding all over. And then, what was it? In 3900 BCE, that was the next transitionary period. There was intense aridity in the Sahara. The Flandrian transgression caused widespread flooding in Asia. And then the most recent one, which was the Homeric minimum, was, 11,000 BCE to 800 BCE, and that was the worldwide collapse of civilizations during the Greek Dark Ages, also called the Age of Heroes by the Greeks. So yeah, the article is well worth reading. I'll be posting it right below the video about the Greek Dark Ages. And yeah. So what the article says about this epoch that we're currently entering is that in accordance with convention, the 300-year transitional period following 2025 can be broken into two periods of 150 years each. The first 150-year period, the twilight of Kali, is when the Kali Yuga structures may collapse due to a combination of wars, environmental catastrophes, and cosmic changes, while the second 150-year period, the dawn of Dwapara, is the time when the spiritually evolved systems and philosophies of the Dwapara Yuga may begin to emerge. It is likely, though, that the twin processes of collapse and emergence will progress simultaneously throughout the entire 300-year transitional period, albeit at different intensities. The current upswing in tectonic activities and extreme weather phenomenon, on one hand, and the initial signs of the awakening of a higher consciousness amongst humanity on the other, may be indicative of the fact that the effects of the transitional period are already underway. We need to be aware of these greater cycles of time that govern human civilization and the changes that are looming on the horizon. So yeah, the article is really worth reading. It's pretty long, but it's chock full of information, and very little of it is fat to be trimmed, so to speak. It's pretty much all worthwhile information. So I really recommend reading it. But yeah, so about the whole ascension thing, I think it's a neurological process brought on by the sun. It's something that's already pretty commonly accepted that when there is increased solar activity, say from a solar flare or something, there is a huge spark in mental illness, that kind of thing. So I think that increased solar activity causes, increased neurological activity and deviant neurological activity. Not necessarily bad, just different from the norm. And so it's like, it's basically Armageddon in a nutshell, right? Some people are going up, other people don't handle the complex emotions as well, and they have difficulty adjusting, and that manifests as mental illness. Or, if you're the Norse writing about it, some crazy fucking times. Incidentally, you should read about Ragnarok and what their prophecies say, because my guess is that they were writing about the transitionary period of Atlantis 12,000 years ago. Just my guess. I'll talk about that probably in a later podcast. But yeah, it's it's some trippy stuff. I definitely recommend reading about the Norse version of Ragnarok, or the Norse myth of Ragnarok, I guess. But what it all comes down to is that our galaxy, and presumably the entire cosmos, is in this constant state of change. Um, because, like I said before, right, the black holes at the center of our galaxy, they're like 25,000 light years away, and this cycle of ours is 24,000 years, which scientists, I think they say that it takes like 26,000 years actually for the axis to fully rotate. I think they're wrong. I've read that it actually speeds up and slows down relative to where it is in the cycle. But anyway, regardless, we're talking about 24,000 years, 25,000 years, 26,000 years. They're all in the same relative ballpark of each other. Same as the 2012 transitionary date versus the Vedic calendar's 2025 transitionary date. They're all in the same ballpark. So yeah, assuming that this great year is a product of the black holes that are 25,000 light years away at the center of the galaxy, and I think it's a pretty safe bet that the 24, 25, 26,000 year great year is, because that's a hell of a correlation. Um, you know, uh, I think that it's safe to assume that the rest of the cosmos, all the galaxies throughout there, operate in a very similar manner. So it's not just something local to our world, it's likely something local to every world, which is to say, something intrinsic to consciousness itself, this cycle that we're going through. And this transitionary period is that we're entering right now, this 300-year period, is, according to a lot of the writings, the biggest of the entire 24,000-year cycle. So, yeah, interesting time to be alive.